the quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other. In one of the quiet, cozy neighborhoods of a small town, where life moved slowly and predictably, every house was part of a shared history. The streets were paved with cobblestones, worn smooth by decades of footsteps and bicycle tires, and old maple trees lined the sidewalks, their branches forming a canopy that turned golden and crimson in the fall. Children played outside until sunset, their laughter echoing through the streets, and neighbors knew each other not just by face, but by name, by story, by habit. It was a place where people felt safe, where every day resembled the last, and where nothing ever disturbed the peace. The town had a rhythm, a heartbeat that pulsed with the seasons, and the people who lived there cherished its predictability. Among all the houses, one stood out, an old but well-kept home with white shutters and a porch adorned with geraniums in pots. This was the home of an elderly couple, Margaret and John Carter. They had lived there for over 40 years, and their house was something of a local landmark, a symbol of stability and warmth. John, a tall, silver-haired man with a stern yet kind gaze, always kept the house in perfect order. He was the kind of man who took pride in his work, whether it was mowing the lawn, fixing a leaky faucet, or repainting the shutters every few years. Margaret, his wife, was a woman with soft features but a shadow of sadness in her eyes. Her life had not been easy, and many in the neighborhood knew about her struggle with alcohol. John and Margaret, a story of love and struggle. John and Margaret had met in their youth, and their love was the kind you read about in novels. John, a war veteran, had returned home with a firm resolve to build a quiet, peaceful life. He had seen enough chaos and destruction during his service, and all he wanted was a simple existence with the woman he loved. Margaret, then young and full of hope, became his anchor. She was a schoolteacher, passionate about literature and art, and her gentle nature balanced John's more stoic demeanor. They bought their house shortly after getting married, a modest but charming home that they poured their hearts into. Over the years, they raised 2 children, a son and a daughter, who had long since moved to other cities for work and family. On the surface, their life seemed perfect. John worked as a mechanic at the local garage, and Margaret continued teaching until her retirement. They were active in the community, attending church on Sundays and hosting neighborhood gatherings on their porch during the summer. But behind the facade of contentment lay a struggle. Margaret, always sensitive and emotional, had started drinking after their younger son, Michael, died in a car accident. He had been just 22 with his whole life ahead of him, and his death shattered Margaret's world. She blamed herself, wondering if she could have done something to prevent it, and the guilt consumed her. John, a man of strict principles, couldn't accept that his wife was drowning her grief in alcohol. He tried to help her, pleading, scolding, supporting, but Margaret's addiction only grew stronger. Despite this, he never gave up on her. Their love was stronger than her illness, and John continued to fight for her, even when she herself had nearly given up. John's death and Margaret's loneliness. When John passed away a year ago, the entire neighborhood mourned with Margaret. His funeral was an event that brought almost every resident together. John had been a respected man, known for his integrity and kindness, and his death left a void not only in Margaret's heart but in the life of the entire community. For Margaret, it was a catastrophe. Already barely holding on, she had lost her last anchor. Her children, living far away, visited rarely, and she was left alone in the big empty house that now felt foreign to her. Neighbors noticed how Margaret began drinking even more. She rarely left the house, and when she did, she looked haggard and lost. Her once well-kept garden began to overgrow with weeds, and the porch where she used to sit with John now stood empty. People felt sorry for her, but no one knew how to help. Every time someone tried to talk to her, she would brush them off, saying she was fine. The arrival of a new man. 2 months after John's death, a new man entered Margaret's life. His name was Robert, and he had found her through a dating site for seniors. Robert was tall, with rough features and a cold, piercing gaze. He moved in with Margaret quickly, and this sparked a wave of gossip among the neighbors. No one could understand how she, still grieving the loss of her husband, could let a stranger into her life. Robert was a mysterious figure. He rarely left the house, and when he did, he was always seen carrying several bottles of alcohol. Neighbors began to notice that he was buying vodka and whiskey every day or two, and it made them uneasy. There was something suspicious about his behavior, but no one dared to ask questions. Margaret, who used to at least occasionally appear outside, now almost never left the house. When she was seen, she looked even more worn out than before. The seeds of suspicion. The neighbors began to whisper. Some said Robert was using Margaret to take over her house. Others speculated that he was just looking for a place to live off someone else's dime. But there were those who saw more. Mary, an elderly neighbor who lived across the street, once noticed Robert yelling at Margaret as they stood on the porch. His face was twisted with anger and she, hunched over, stayed silent as if accustomed to such treatment. "Something's not right," Mary said to her friend over a cup of tea. "She looks like she's afraid of him. I've never seen Margaret so broken." But no one intervened. Everyone thought it wasn't their place, that Margaret had to sort out her own life. Meanwhile, Robert kept buying alcohol, and the Carter home sank deeper into an atmosphere of gloom and despair. The police arrived. One morning, the quiet of the neighborhood was shattered by the sound of sirens. 2 police vans, an ambulance, and crime scene investigators' vehicles pulled up to Margaret's house. A crowd of onlookers gathered, watching as officers carried out bags of evidence. Neighbors, standing off to the side, whispered among themselves, trying to piece together what had happened. "Did you hear?" Mary asked her husband. "They say Robert tried to kill her. Used her weakness for alcohol to take over the house." But as the rumors began to take shape, a different story emerged. According to neighbors, Margaret, driven to despair by constant abuse and cruelty from Robert, had decided to put an end to it. She had, as they say, taken irreversible action to protect herself. The empty house and the silence. Now the Carter house stands empty, its windows boarded up and its garden overgrown. Margaret, it's rumored, has been placed in a secure facility, where she will likely spend the rest of her days. Her fate has become a grim reminder of how quickly life can change and how easily a person can lose everything they hold dear. The neighbors still talk about the story, adding new details each time. Some say they saw Robert acting aggressively, while others recall how Margaret looked increasingly haggard in the weeks leading up to the incident. But everyone agrees on one thing: it was a tragedy that left a deep mark on their once peaceful little world. New twists and revelations. As time passed, more details about Robert's past began to surface. It turned out he had a criminal record, fraud, domestic violence, and even a stint in prison for assault. He had been moving from town to town, preying on vulnerable women, often those who were lonely or struggling with addiction. Margaret, in her grief and isolation, had been an easy target. The police investigation revealed that Robert had been systematically isolating Margaret from her neighbors, cutting off her phone and controlling her access to money. He had also been forging documents to transfer ownership of the house to his name. The bottles of alcohol he bought were not just for her, he was using them to keep her dependent and compliant. Margaret's children, who had been distant for years, were devastated when they learned the full extent of what had happened. They visited her in the facility, trying to make amends for their absence. Margaret, though physically frail, seemed to find some peace in their presence. She began attending therapy sessions and slowly started to open up about the abuse she had endured. The neighborhood's reaction. The tragedy shook the neighborhood to its core. People who had once turned a blind eye now regretted not intervening sooner. A community meeting was held, and residents decided to create a neighborhood watch program to ensure no one would ever feel so alone again. They also started a support group for those struggling with addiction or abuse, naming it in honor of Margaret. Mary, who had been one of the few to voice her concerns, became an advocate for the elderly in the community. She organized regular check-ins and social events to combat loneliness and isolation. The once quiet streets now buzzed with a renewed sense of connection and care. Margaret's legacy. Margaret never returned to her old home. It was sold, and the proceeds were used to fund her care and support groups in the community. The new owners, a young family, restored the house to its former glory, planting new flowers in the garden and repainting the shutters. The porch, once a place of solitude, now echoed with the laughter of children. Margaret's story became a cautionary tale, but also one of resilience. Despite everything she had endured, she had found the strength to protect herself and, in doing so, had inspired her community to come together. Her legacy lived on in the kindness and vigilance of her neighbors, who vowed never to let such a tragedy happen again. The broader impact. The story of Margaret and Robert reached beyond the small town, sparking conversations about elder abuse and the importance of community support. Local newspapers picked up the story, and it was even featured in a national magazine. Advocacy groups used Margaret's experience to push for stricter regulations on dating sites for seniors, ensuring better background checks and safeguards for vulnerable users. In the years that followed, the neighborhood became a model for other communities. Schools incorporated lessons on recognizing and preventing abuse, and local businesses sponsored events to raise awareness. Margaret's name became synonymous with courage and the power of community action. A new chapter. Though Margaret's life had taken a tragic turn, her story ultimately brought about positive change. The quiet neighborhood, once defined by its predictability, had learned to adapt and grow. The cobblestone streets and maple trees remained, but the people who walked beneath them were more connected, more aware, and more committed to looking out for one another. And so, the story of Margaret and John Carter, of love and loss, of struggle and resilience, became a part of the town's history, a reminder that even in the quietest places, life can be both fragile and profoundly powerful.